On the Soul and the Resurrection by Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Part 10. We must not follow either, as though they had hit the truth, those who suppose that souls pass from women's bodies to live in men's, or, reversely, that souls that have parted with men's bodies exist in women. Or even if they only say that they pass from men into men, or from women into women. As for the former theory, not only has it been rejected for being shifting and illusory, and for landing us in opinions diametrically opposed to each other, but it must be rejected also because it is a godless theory, maintaining as it does that nothing among the things in nature is brought into existence without deriving its peculiar constitution from evil at its source. If, that is, neither men, nor plants, nor cattle can be born unless some soul from above has fallen into them, and if this fall is owing to some tendency to evil, then they evidently think that evil controls the creation of all things. In some mysterious way, too, both events are to occur at once, the birth of the man in consequence of a marriage, and the fall of the soul, synchronizing as it must with the proceedings at that marriage. A greater absurdity even than this is involved. If, as is the fact, a large majority of the brute creation copulate in the spring, are we then to say that the spring brings it about that evil is engendered in the revolving world above, so that at one and the same moment there certain souls are impregnated with evil and so fall, and here certain animals conceive? And what are we to say about the husbandman who sets the vine shoots in the soil? How does his hand manage to have covered in a human soil along with this plant, and how does the molting of wings last simultaneously with his employment in planting? The same absurdity, it is to be observed, exists in the other of the two theories as well. In the direction, I mean, of thinking that the soul must be anxious about the intercourses of those living in wedlock, and must be on the lookout for the times of bringing forth, in order that it may insinuate itself into the bodies then produced. Supposing the man refuses the union, or the woman keeps herself clear of the necessity of becoming a mother, will evil then fail to weigh down that particular soul? Will it be marriage, in consequence, that sounds up above the first note of evil in the soul? Or will this reverse state invade the soul quite independently of any marriage? But then in this last case the soul will have to wander about in the interval, like a houseless vagabond, lapsed as it has from its heavenly surroundings, and yet, as may happen in some cases, still without a body to receive it. But how after that can they imagine that the deity exercises any superintendence over the world, referring as they do the beginnings of human lives to this casual and meaningless descent of a soul? For all that follows must necessarily accord with the beginning, and so if a life begins in consequence of a chance accident, the whole course of it becomes at once a chapter of accidents, and the attempt to make the whole world depend on a divine power absurd, when it is made by these men, who deny to the individualities in it a birth from the fiat of the divine will, and refer the several origins of beings to encounters that come of evil, as though there never could have existed such a thing as a human life unless a vice had struck, as it were, its leading note. If the beginning is like that, a sequel will most certainly be set in motion in accordance with that beginning. None would dare to maintain that what is fair can come out of what is foul, any more than from good can come its opposite. We expect fruit in accordance with the nature of the seed. Therefore this blind movement of chance is to rule the whole of life, and no providence is any more to pervade the world. Nay, even the forecasting by our calculations will be quite useless. Virtue will lose its value, and to turn away from evil will not be worth the while. Everything will be entirely under the control of the driver Chance, and our lives will not differ at all from vessels devoid of ballast, and will drift on waves of unaccountable circumstances, now to this, now to that incident of good or evil. The treasures of virtue will never be found in those who owe their constitution to causes quite contrary to virtue. If God really superintends our lives, then confessedly evil cannot begin life. But if we do owe our birth to evil, then we must go on living in complete uniformity with it. Thereby it will be shown that it is folly to talk about the houses of correction, purgatory, which await us after this life is ended, and the just recompenses, and all the other things there asserted and believed in too, that tend to the suppression of vice. For how can a man, owing as he does his birth to evil, be outside its pale? How can he, whose very nature has its rise in a vice, as they assert, possess any deliberate impulse toward a life of virtue? Take any single one of the brute creation. Animals do not attempt to speak like a human being, but in using the natural kind of utterance, sucked in, as it were, with its mother's milk, it deems it no loss to be deprived of articulate speech. Just in the same way, those who believed that a vice was the origin and cause of their being alive will never bring themselves to have a longing after virtue, because it will be a thing quite foreign to their nature. But as a fact, they who by reflecting have cleansed the vision of their soul, do all of them desire and strive after a life of virtue. Therefore it is by that fact clearly proved that vice is not prior in time to the act of beginning to live, and that our nature did not thence derive its source, but that the all-disposing wisdom of God was the cause of it. In short, that the soul issues on the stage of life in the manner which is pleasing to its Creator, and then, but not before, by virtue of its power of willing, is free to choose that which is to its mind, and so, whatever it may wish to be, it becomes that very thing. We may understand this truth by the example of the eyes. To see is their natural state, but to fail to see results to them either from choice or from disease. This unnatural state may supervene instead of the natural, either by willful shutting of the eyes, or by deprivation of their sight through disease. With the like truth, we may assert that the soul derives its constitution from God, and that as we cannot conceive of any vice in him, it is removed from any necessity of being vicious. That nevertheless, though this is the condition in which it came into being, the soul can be attracted of its own free will in a chosen direction, either willfully shutting its eyes to the good, or letting themselves be damaged by that insidious foe whom we have taken home to live with us, and so passing through life in the darkness of error. Or, reversely, preserving undimmed its sight of the truth, and keeping far away from all weaknesses that could darken it. But then someone will ask, when and how did the soul come into being? Now, as for the question how any single thing came into existence, we must banish it altogether from our discussion, even in the case of things which are quite within the grasp of our understanding, and of which we have sensible perception, it would be impossible for the speculative reason to grasp the how of the production of the phenomenon, so much so that even inspired and saintly men have deemed such questions insoluble. For instance, the Apostle says, "Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen are not made of things which do appear." He would not, I take it, have spoken like that if he had thought the question could be settled by any efforts of the reasoning powers. While the Apostle affirms that it is an object of his faith that it was by the will of God that the world itself and all which is therein was framed, whatever this world be that involves the idea of the whole visible and invisible creation, he has, on the other hand, left out of the investigation the how of this framing. Nor do I think that this point can ever be reached by any inquirers. The question presents, on the face of it, many insuperable difficulties. How, for instance, can a world of movement come from one that is at rest? How from the simple and undimensional, that which shows dimension and compositeness? Did it come actually out of the Supreme Being? But the fact that this world presents a difference in kind to that being militates against such a supposition. Did it then come from some other quarter? Yet faith can contemplate nothing as quite outside the divine nature, for we should have to believe in two distinct and separate principles if outside the creative cause we are to suppose something else, which the artificer with all his skill has to put under contribution for the formative processes of the universe. Since then the cause of all things is one and one only, and yet the existences produced by that cause are not of the same nature as its transcendent quality, an inconceivability of equal magnitude arises in both our suppositions, i.e., both that the creation comes straight out of the divine being, and that the universe owes its existence to some cause other than him. For if created things are to be of the same nature as God, we must consider him to be invested with the properties belonging to his creation. Or else a world of matter, outside the circle of God's substance, and equal, on the score of the absence in it of all beginning, to the eternity of the self-existent one, will have to be ranged against him. And this is, in fact, what the followers of Manes and some of the Greek philosophers who held opinions of equal boldness with him did imagine. And they raised this imagination into a system. In order, then, to avoid falling into either of these absurdities which the inquiry into the origin of things involves, let us, following the example of the Apostle, leave the question of the how in each created thing without meddling with it at all, but merely observing, incidentally, that the movement of God's will becomes, at any moment that he pleases, a fact, and the intention becomes at once realized in nature. For omnipotence does not leave the plans of its far-seeing skill in the state of unsubstantial wishes, and the actualizing of a wish is substance. In short, the whole world of existing things falls into two divisions, i.e., that of the intelligible and that of the corporeal. And the intelligible creation does not, to begin with, seem to be in any way at variance with a spiritual being, but on the contrary to verge closely upon him, exhibiting as it does that absence of tangible form and of dimension which we rightly attribute to his transcendent nature. The corporeal creation, on the other hand, must certainly be classed among specialties that have nothing in common with the deity, and it does offer this supreme difficulty to the reason, namely, that the reason cannot see how the visible comes out of the invisible, how the hard solid comes out of the intangible, how the finite comes out of the infinite, how that which is circumscribed by certain proportions, where the idea of quantity comes in, can come from that which has no size, no proportions, and so on through each single circumstance of body. But even about this, we can say so much, i.e., that not one of those things which we attribute to body is itself body. Neither figure, nor color, nor weight, nor extension, nor quantity, nor any other qualifying notion whatsoever. But every one of them is a category. It is the combination of them all into a single whole that constitutes body. Seeing then that these several qualifications which complete the particular body are grasped by thought alone, and not by sense, and that the deity is a thinking being, what trouble can it be to such a thinking agent to produce the thinkables, whose mutual combination generates for us the substance of that body? All this discussion, however, lies outside our present business. The previous question was, if some souls exist anterior to their bodies, when and how do they come into existence? And of this question, again, the part about the how has been left out of our examination, and has not been meddled with, as presenting impenetrable difficulties. There remains the question of the when of the soul's commencement of existence. It follows immediately on that which we have already discussed. For if we were to grant that the soul has lived previous to its body in some place of resort peculiar to itself, then we cannot avoid seeing some force in all that fantastic teaching lately discussed, which would explain the soul's habitation of the body as a consequence of some vice. Again, on the other hand, no one who can reflect will imagine an afterbirth of the soul, i.e., that it is younger than the moulding of the body. For everyone can see for himself that not one among all the things that are inanimate or soulless possesses any power of motion or of growth. Whereas there is no question about that which is bred in the uterus, both growing and moving from place to place. It remains, therefore, that we must think that the point of commencement for existence is one and the same for body and soul. Also, we affirm that just as the earth receives the sapling from the hands of the husbandman and makes a tree of it without itself imparting the power of growth to its nursling, but only lending it, when placed within itself, the impulse to grow, in this very way, that which is secreted from a man for the planting of a man is itself, to a certain extent, a living being as much gifted with a soul and as capable of nourishing itself as that from which it comes. If this offshoot in its diminutiveness cannot contain at first all the activities and the movements of the soul, we need not be surprised, for neither in the seed of grain is there visible all at once the ear. How indeed could anything so large be crowded into so small a space? But the earth keeps on feeding it with its congenial aliment, and so the grain becomes the ear, without changing its nature while in the clod, but only developing it and bringing it to perfection under the stimulus of that nourishment. As, then, in the case of those growing seeds, the advance to perfection is a graduated one, so in man's formation the forces of his soul show themselves in proportion to the size to which his body has attained. They dawn first in the fetus, in the shape of the power of nutrition and of development. After that, they introduce into the organism that has come into the light the gift of perception. Then, when this is reached, they manifest a certain measure of the reasoning faculty, like the fruit of some matured plant, not growing all of it at once, but in a continuous progress along with the shooting up of that plant. Seeing, then, that that which is secreted from one living being to lay the foundations of another living being cannot itself be dead, for a state of deadness arises from the privation of life, and it cannot be that privation should precede the having. We grasp from these considerations the fact that in the compound which results from the joining of both soul and body, there is a simultaneous passage of both into existence. The one does not come first any more than the other comes after. But as to the number of souls, our reason must necessarily contemplate a stopping some day of its increase, so that nature's stream may not flow on forever, pouring forward in her successive births, and never staying that onward movement. The reason for our race having some day to come to a standstill is as follows, in our opinion. Since every intellectual reality is fixed in a plenitude of its own, it is reasonable to expect that humanity also will arrive at a goal. For in this respect also, humanity is not to be parted from the intellectual world, so that we are to believe that it will not be visible forever only in defective form, as it is now. For this continual addition of after generations indicates that there is something deficient in our race. Whenever then humanity shall have reached the plenitude that belongs to it, this on-streaming movement of production will altogether cease. It will have touched its destined bourne, and a new order of things, quite distinct from the present precession of births and deaths, will carry on the life of humanity. If there is no birth, it follows necessarily that there will be nothing to die. Composition must precede dissolution, and by composition I mean the coming into this world by being born. Necessarily, therefore, if this synthesis does not proceed, no dissolution will follow. Therefore, if we are to go upon probabilities, the life after this is shown to us beforehand as something that is fixed and imperishable, with no birth and no decay to change it. The teacher finished her exposition, and to the many persons sitting by her bedside, the whole discussion seemed now to have arrived at a fitting conclusion. Nevertheless, fearing that if the teacher's illness took a fatal turn, such as did actually happen, we should have no one among us to answer the objections of the unbelievers to the resurrection, I still insisted. The argument has not yet touched the most vital of all the questions relating to our faith. I mean that the inspired writings, both in the New and Old Testament, declare most emphatically not only that when our race has completed the ordered chain of its existence, as the ages lapse through their complete circle, this current streaming onward as generation succeeds generation will cease altogether, but also that then, when the completed universe no longer admits of further increase, all the souls in their entire number will come back out of their invisible and scattered condition into tangibility and light, the identical atoms belonging to each soul reassembling together in the same order as before. And this reconstitution of human life is called in these writings, which contain God's teachings, the resurrection, the entire movement of the atoms receiving the same term as the raising up of that which is actually prostrate on the ground. "But," said she, "which of these points has been left unnoticed in what has been said?" "Why, the actual doctrine of the resurrection," I replied. "And yet," she answered, "much in our long and detailed discussion pointed to that." "Then are you not aware," I insisted, "of all the objections, a very swarm of them, which our antagonists bring against us in connection with that hope of yours?" And I at once tried to repeat all the devices hit upon by their captious champions to upset the doctrine of the resurrection. End of Part 10 of On the Soul and the Resurrection.